Doll test origins. Imagine a small room in the late 1930s. The air is thick with unspoken rules. A young black child, no older than 7, sits at a small wooden table. In front of them are 4 dolls. They look identical in every way but one. 2 are brown with black hair. 2 are white with yellow hair. A kind voice asks a series of simple questions, but the answers will be anything but simple. The answers will expose a deep, festering wound in the heart of a nation. This was not a game. This was a diagnosis. This was the beginning of the end for legal segregation in America. This was the doll test. To understand the shocking power of this experiment, you have to feel the world it was born into. This was the era of Jim Crow, a system of state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States and beyond. It was a reality built on a lie, the lie of separate but equal. But everyone knew it was a lie. The separation was absolute. The equality was a fantasy. Black children walking past a pristine, empty, whites-only playground on their way to a dilapidated, underfunded school. Separate water fountains, one clean and refrigerated, the other a rusty tap. The back of the bus. The constant daily barrage of messages, both subtle and brutally direct, that to be black was to be less than, less intelligent, less worthy, less human. This system wasn't just about controlling bodies, it was about colonizing minds. It was a psychological war waged on children from the moment they were born. Into this world stepped 2 brilliant, revolutionary minds, Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark. They were more than just psychologists, they were pioneers. A husband and wife team of black scholars educated at Howard and Columbia University, determined to use the tools of their trade not just for academic curiosity, but for liberation. And it's Mamie Phipps Clark whose story we must tell first. Because the seed of the doll test, the very foundation of this world-changing research, began with her. As a graduate student for her master's thesis in the 1930s, Mamie was fascinated and horrified by the development of racial identity and self-awareness in young black children. When did they learn that society saw their skin color as a mark of inferiority? And what did that knowledge do to them? This was the question that drove her. Working with her husband, she developed a deceptively simple yet profoundly insightful methodology. They went into segregated nursery schools in Washington, D.C., and later integrated schools in New York to understand the problem from all sides. They sat down with children, aged 3 to 7, and presented them with the 4 dolls. Then came the questions, a carefully crafted sequence designed to peel back the layers of a child's developing consciousness. First, the identification questions. Show me the doll that looks like a white child. Show me the doll that looks like a colored child. Show me the doll that looks like a Negro child. This established that the children could correctly identify the dolls based on race. But then, the questions turned, probing deeper into the realm of value and preference. Show me the doll that you like to play with. Over and over, a majority of the black children pointed to the white doll. Show me the doll that is the nice doll. Again, the white doll. The preference was clear, consistent, and heartbreaking. But the Clarks pushed further into the darkest territory of all. They asked, show me the doll that looks bad. A significant number of the children, these beautiful, innocent black children, pointed to the brown doll with black hair. They had learned, in their few short years on this earth, to associate their own color with negativity. The societal poison had already entered their bloodstream. And then came the final devastating question. The one that often reduced children to tears or made them storm out of the room in distress. The question that revealed the full extent of the psychological damage. The experimenter would ask with gentle gravity, "Now, show me the doll that is like you." The descriptions of these moments are gut-wrenching. Many children would hesitate. Some would get visibly upset. A few would refuse to answer. But a majority would point, often reluctantly, to the brown doll, the same doll they had just labeled as bad, ugly, and undesirable. One child, when asked to identify the doll that was like him, looked at the brown doll and smiled. "That's a nigger. I'm a nigger." He said it with a chilling degree of distress and resignation. Another little girl who had identified the white doll as nice and the brown doll as bad broke down into tears, inconsolable, when she had to admit that she was most like the bad doll. This wasn't a statistic. This was the sound of a child's self-esteem being crushed under the heel of a racist society. The Clarks had captured the moment of psychic fracture. They had made the invisible wound of segregation visible. They had proven with the rigorous methodology of science that the lie of separate but equal was a soul-destroying fallacy. It was teaching black children to hate themselves. This was not an opinion. It was data. And this data was about to become a weapon.
Block 2. Scientific proof segregation. The Clarks' findings were an earthquake. In a world that dismissed black experiences as anecdotal or emotional, they presented cold, hard, scientific proof of psychological devastation. Their charts and numbers told a story more powerful than any speech. This wasn't just a research paper destined to gather dust in a university library. It was a lit match thrown into the powder keg of American jurisprudence. To grasp the magnitude of this, you have to understand the legal fortress they were up against. The 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This was the case that enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal into the law of the land. For over half a century, it was the legal bedrock of Jim Crow, a nearly impenetrable shield for segregationists. The logic was that as long as the facilities provided to both races were equal, then separating them was perfectly constitutional. The challenge for civil rights lawyers was monumental. How do you attack a precedent that has stood for decades? You couldn't just argue that the black schools were underfunded and the white schools were pristine, though they were. Segregationists could simply counter by promising to equalize funding, a promise they rarely kept. The brilliant legal minds at the NAACP, led by the legendary Thurgood Marshall, knew they needed a new line of attack. They had to prove that the act of separation itself, regardless of the quality of facilities, inflicted a unique and undeniable harm. They needed to prove that separate could be equal. But how do you prove an invisible injury? How do you show a judge the damage to a child's psyche? This is where the Clark's doll test became the key that would unlock the courthouse doors. Thurgood Marshall and his team saw the explosive potential in this research. It was exactly what they were looking for: tangible, empirical evidence of the psychological harm of segregation. They recruited Kenneth Clark to serve as an expert witness in several of the landmark cases that were being bundled together to challenge school segregation. Cases like Briggs v. Elliott in South Carolina. Imagine the scene. A courtroom in the Deep South in the early 1950s. The air is tense, the racial hierarchy palpable. On the witness stand is Dr. Kenneth Clark, a calm, articulate black intellectual. He isn't there to talk about legal precedents or funding disparities. He is there to talk about the inner lives of children. He presents the dolls. He describes the methodology. He recounts the heartbreaking answers from the children in that very state. He explained that segregation was not a benign social policy. It was a source of basic personality distortion. He testified that forcing black children into segregated schools stamped them with a badge of inferiority that would harm their ability to learn and affect them for the rest of their lives. This was a radical act. He was using the language of science to force the legal system to confront the human cost of its doctrines. The segregationist lawyers were baffled. They tried to dismiss the findings. They attacked the methodology, calling it unscientific, claiming the dolls were just toys and the children's answers were meaningless. But the power of the testimony was undeniable. It was emotional, yes, but it was rooted in systematic observation and data. It reframed the entire debate. The central injury of segregation wasn't a leaky roof in a schoolhouse. It was a crack in a child's soul. The culmination of this legal strategy was the monumental 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. This case consolidated several challenges to school segregation from across the country. The NAACP's legal brief leaned heavily on the work of the Clarks and other social scientists. And when the Supreme Court delivered its unanimous, nation-altering decision, the influence of this work was made explicit. In a now famous section, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separating black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. And then came the knockout blow, buried in what is arguably the most important footnote in American legal history. Footnote 11. In that footnote, the Supreme Court directly cited the work of Kenneth Clark and other contemporary social scientists as evidence for their conclusion. They explicitly referenced the psychological damage that segregation inflicted. It was a watershed moment. For the first time, the highest court in the land had used psychological research as a basis for a major constitutional ruling. The doll test had officially become part of the legal canon, a scientific testament to the inherent inequality of segregation. The Plessy v. Ferguson fortress had been breached. The lie of separate but equal was, at long last, legally dead. The Clarks had done more than publish a study. They had provided the scientific justification for a revolution.
Block 3. Erased Legacy. Clark. The victory in Brown v. Board of Education should have been the final, triumphant chapter in the story of the doll test. It should have cemented Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark as heroes in the pantheon of the civil rights movement, their names etched alongside the legal giants and activist leaders. But history is rarely so neat, and recognition is never guaranteed, especially for black intellectuals and most especially for black women. In the decades that followed, a strange and tragic forgetting began to take place. The story of the doll test became simplified, its origins blurred. And in that blurring, the pivotal, foundational contributions of Mamie Phipps Clark began to fade into the background, overshadowed by her husband and the male-dominated narrative of the legal battle. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a reflection of the very systemic biases the Clarks had fought against. In academia and in the media, Kenneth Clark, as the man who testified in court and became a public figure, was often credited as the sole or primary creator of the research. But this erases the truth. The doll test was born from Mamie's mind. It was her master's thesis that laid the groundwork. It was her intellectual curiosity and rigorous design that shaped the study from its inception. She was not her husband's assistant. She was his equal partner, and in many ways the architect of their most famous work. The failure of historical accounts to properly credit her is a profound injustice, a second erasure that mirrors the social invisibility she worked to combat. But to limit their legacy to just the doll test or even the Brown v. Board decision is to miss the larger picture of their life's work. They were not just diagnosticians of a social sickness. They were dedicated healers. Their work didn't end when the gavel fell in the Supreme Court. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. In 1946, long before the Brown decision, they took their research and their passion and founded the Northside Center for Child Development in Harlem. This was a revolutionary act in itself. It was one of the first full-time child guidance centers offering psychological and casework services to children and families in the community. Think about what this meant. In an era where mental health services were largely unavailable to Black communities and often culturally incompetent when they were, the Clarks created a haven. They provided therapy, counseling, and educational testing. They treated the very psychological wounds they had so powerfully documented in their research. The Northside Center was the doll test put into practice, a living, breathing institution dedicated to building the self-esteem and resilience of children of color. Mamie Phipps Clark served as its executive director for over 30 years, guiding its mission and touching the lives of thousands. This, as much as any study, is her true legacy, a legacy of direct action and community care that has been almost completely overshadowed by the single famous experiment. Over the years, the doll test has also faced its share of academic critique. Some scholars have questioned whether a preference for a white doll truly equates to self-hatred, suggesting it could simply reflect an awareness of which race holds power in society. Others have pointed out that in replications of the study, the results have varied, with some modern studies showing a much stronger pro-Black preference among Black children, a potential sign of progress. But these debates don't diminish the original work. They enrich it. They show that the Clarks started a conversation that continues to this day about the complex interplay of race, identity, and power. Their work was a product of its time, designed to fight a specific legal battle, and it succeeded spectacularly. The fact that we can now have more nuanced discussions is a testament to the ground they broke. The ultimate tragedy is that in remembering the symbol, we have forgotten the people. We remember the image of the dolls, but we forget the names of the brilliant, courageous scientists who wielded them as instruments of justice. We especially forget Mamie Phipps Clark, the architect. Their story is a powerful reminder that progress is not inevitable. It is fought for by individuals. And the story of that progress is itself a battleground, where some contributions are celebrated while others are silenced. To truly honor the legacy of the Clarks is to do more than just recall their famous experiment. It is to recognize their lifelong commitment to action, to celebrate their intellectual partnership, and to finally and unequivocally write Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark's name back into the center of the story where it has always belonged. Their work didn't just change the law. It changed how we see the hidden costs of injustice, a lesson that remains as urgent today as it was over 70 years ago.